Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, May 25th of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is May 31st. Each Tuesday, we simply call in from wherever we may be, our homes, our travels, our hotels, at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. If you're focusing on the Gospel Lectionary this week or preparing for a virtual discussion group during this pandemic, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. And here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information or questions on what the leadoff person on the call would like to discuss. And then we develop perspectives and share, encourage, and challenge each other. And a new feature, Charles Willard, will share some opening perspectives on what we call What Would They Have Heard? And this will help us consider the differences in authors, purposes of the writing, and the challenges of time and culture. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Sarah Mickelson.
Bill Hall.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton. And just want to let everybody know we've gotten some feedback on moving these calls from Thursday mornings to Tuesday mornings. So welcome back to Tuesday. Those 2 extra days of preparation before the Lectionary Sunday Gospel has been helpful, and we're glad to be here a little bit earlier in the week. To kick us off today, Sarah Mickelson is going to read the scripture and offer some opening comments. Hello, my friend.
Good morning, everybody. Well, I'm excited because I think this is the first time we've ever studied this particular passage, and I think I laughed when I read the scripture because it was very short, and I invite you into the dance. We're reading from John chapter 7, verses 37 through 39. On the last day of the festival, the great day, while Jesus was standing there, he cried out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." Now he said this about the Spirit, which believers in him were to receive, for as of yet there was no Spirit, because Jesus was not yet glorified. So in reading that, I kind of went, what festival? Why were they gathered together? How does this relate to Pentecost, which is the season we're moving into? And so I kind of went through this whole litany in my head of questions about why this passage today, lectionary wisdom, lectionary madness, I'm not sure. But it led me through the what is in this passage for us today from Pentecost. So I would invite you to listen and add. We would love to hear from you. Add some comments if you need to. Help us see what we've missed, or help us let us know we've maybe teetered too far into madness to figure out the connections to Pentecost for this passage. I think at this point I'm going to move to Charles and let him tell us a little bit more about what he would like to offer for the kickoff today.
Thank you, Sarah. I admit, as you began to have the conversation you were having, I thought, "Oops, she forgot me," but you didn't. So thank you, thank you very much. I wanted to make only 2 kinds of comments. One is mechanical, and one is what I'll call just an observation. In most of the way that the liturgical year runs, we're comfortable with the timing because we study Christmas and Advent about the time that Christmas and Advent is coming, and we are studying Easter and the events surrounding Easter around the time that Easter is coming, and so it fits right into our sense of what we're reading about, and the timing of it and the spacing of it it's in the same timing and spacing that we are. And because nothing is specifically made about this particular passage, John, this is another kind of a sideline here. the liturgical calendar is arranged around three years. And so if you start counting the number of Gospels, you count Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so you've got 3. And then you say, well, what about John? And John in the liturgical calendar has to be a place found for. And so John is tucked in here and there in various places. And so it happens that this particular event that is being described in the Gospel of John doesn't occur when it's set. So this is not happening right after Easter. It's not happening right before Pentecost. This particular event is actually happening way back in the fall. Why? Because it's said at the time that a great celebration was going on in the Jewish tradition, which was it's the completion of the season. The grain has been harvested, it's been taken in, and this is the celebration of that event. And it takes 7 days. And it's a significant event, but it's an event that occurs in the fall, and so the things that are happening there are not happening right after the crucifixion, right before the ascension, after the ascension, or just before the giving of the Holy Spirit. It's happening at a very different time, and the gospel writers, the liturgy specialists, and arrangers have simply arranged that part of John is going to occur at that particular place. So it's a spacing and a timing issue. I wanted to make one other technical observation then, because it's caused trouble, and it's a nice little text critical observation. This is in let's say I read it very nicely, because this is in the 39th verse where it says there was no Spirit. And most people, if they're conscious and thinking about it, we're thinking, well, wait a minute. I thought the Spirit had been around all the time. What do you mean there was no Spirit? Where was he? And so if you study the text, the Bible that most of us read just says there was no Spirit because Jesus was not yet glorified. Some have a little asterisk or other mark by the word Spirit to indicate there's something there that the attentive reader ought to look at. And so you look at the bottom, and you see there's a whole lot of options there, because it's not as though every single of the thousands, the 2,000 or more manuscripts that we have of the New Testament, that they all say the same thing word for word in exactly the same order, spelled the same way, etc. They don't. They're a real mixture. And so in this particular case, there are some manuscripts that say no Spirit. There's some manuscripts that say Holy Spirit. There's more other manuscripts that say the Spirit giver or given. And the text critics have a remarkably skilled way of trying to discern which was more likely or most likely to be the original. And there is, of course, no way to know for sure, because nobody has the original. It's if it exists, nobody knows where it is. But the rule that they have is, I'll see if I can pronounce this correctly in Latin, Lectionary difficilior potior, which is translated roughly, the more difficult reading is better. And the more difficult reading would be the one that we have here. There was no Spirit, because it's easier to imagine, if you think about it, how these other additions would have been added by a scribe or somebody who was reading and thinking, well, that's not right, it must be, and then added Holy Spirit or Spirit given, which are the two main additions that have been made that fix this up. But what we have is the Spirit. And of course, we do know that the Spirit was there from the beginning, and we know that John knew that, and he simply wrote it this way. Sarah, back to you. Thank you, ma'am.
I feel compelled to set the table a little bit. So this particular festival is called the Festival of Tabernacles, or Booths, It was one of 3 holy days where Jewish men would travel to the temple, and they would construct temporary shelters, usually out of branches, and they would decorate them with fruits and berries and things that would be fragrant and things that would be beautiful, and they would gather in these particular temporary shelters and have meals, communal meals. You'd be invited in. If it was not yours, you would be invited in. And some people would even sleep in these temporary shelters, and it was important that in the construction of them, the roofs of them were slightly open for rain and for viewing the stars. This particular practice was done in remembrance of the 40 years of wandering in the desert after leaving Egypt and before coming into the Promised Land. During that time, the Spirit of the Lord would dwell in a temporary dwelling, like a tent or a shelter, and that you would go into that temporary space to commune with the Lord. And this is also a touch point to remember how God's provision of the Jewish families as they left Egypt, the provision of fire by night and manna in the morning, and taking care of becoming and shaping and transitioning them from people who had been in slavery into a people ready for the Promised Land. I found that very helpful to hear what was the temple, what was this festival about, what was the practice each day, and they would go into the temple each day, and there would be an offering of water from the pool of Siloam, and a pouring out of that water on the altar to cleanse it and wash it for the offerings of that day. So you would bring in your harvest, and this would be something that would be shared communally. So it's this interesting idea of the water from the pool of Siloam, who's fed by the spring of Gihon, and it's within walking distance of the Jerusalem temple. And it was a precedent, something that the water would flow fresh from this spring, and it was something that was given by God, and that the priest would gather it with a golden vessel and carry it back each day, and it was part of the process to walk with the water all the way back to the temple, and then wash the offering, wash the altar for the offerings that day. So I found that helpful. I hope it's helpful to you. There were specific words said, and these words touch into, I think, why the lectionary team might have invited this particular passage for a Pentecost explanation. The outpouring of the Spirit, there's some symbolism here that Jesus has not been outpoured yet, and that the water is outpouring as a representation of the Spirit that's to come. That being said, it led me down a list of questions that I'll share now. What insights can we glean from considering the ingathering, this idea that the festival was an ingathering, and symbolic elements of the festival itself as a backdrop for Pentecost? My second question is, what do we know about the pool of Siloam, the Gihon spring, which feeds it, and its significance to the festival of tabernacles, the temple itself, and Jerusalem as a city? That's a geography lesson for some people. The third question is the 8th day of this festival, called, and I'm going to probably blow this, Charles, so bear with me.
You're fine.
Shemini at Zeret, which held a very unique significance prior to and during the time of Jesus. What are your thoughts about its significance for us today as we experience the pandemic and the move into the Pentecostal season? So I'm going to go back and read question number 1 because these are kind of wordy questions. What insights can we glean from considering the ingathering and the symbolic elements of the Festival of Tabernacles as a backdrop for Pentecost? The Raise your hand if you'd like to answer this question first, gentlemen.
I'll take a crack at it.
Go ahead, Don.
Well, and I'm one of the lay people on this call, so I know we have folks that are in my position who have been asked to facilitate a class or a discussion, and during the pandemic it may be virtual. So I just want to just say that I have no expertise on the Festival of Tabernacles, and you might not either, or the cultural practices of the time. And what I do know has often been curated by other people, and that information comes from many places and many times in my life. And I did my best this week to study what I can, and maybe you did too, if you're preparing for a class. And I had a sense of pasting things together. But I know it's in the book of John, and I was thinking about, the idea that we have of Pentecost is very much related to Acts in a lot of cases, and this isn't Acts, this is John. And since we're talking about this being a period of harvest and bounty, out of sync on our calendar, but I want to focus on that. But that's something that your class may understand. We all understand those seasons. And at the end of John, there isn't the classic Pentecost that we're raised to think about, maybe, if you grew up in the church. But there is real bounty and a net picking up fish as Jesus is standing on the beach, and they are all running to or sailing to Jesus. Peter dives in and goes to Jesus, so there's some bounty at the end. But I was thinking about if you're facilitating a group, and is there a simple start? So maybe here's a little help. A 2-column question about comparing the festival with an idea of Pentecost in the Synoptics and in John and in Acts, what that might look like. And I came up with a few ideas that might help. It might break open a few thoughts based on our own experience. And here's just some simple examples. And I'll just do festival versus our idea of Pentecost. And in festival, it's the end of a season, and it's a harvest time. And in Pentecost, the class members may say it's the beginning of the season. One is related to the earth moving around the sun at a particular time, and the other just starts going. Pentecost just starts going. Another would be it's a finite period of time, 7 or 8 days for the festival, with a beginning and a middle and an end. This suggests a great end, a climax, that's something at the end. And then on the Pentecost side, we may remember Pentecost around the same time each year, but it's more of a story of an engagement and venturing out, not venturing into a place like a festival. Next would be, if you ask this for a class, they may say, well, it's a build-up that does reach to a final great day. And in this case, if you look at Pentecost, John is filled up with many build-ups. Each little story has a beginning and a middle and an end. Just put yourself into a John story. They meet, they talk, they depart. They travel, they heal, they leave. They're restored to community. With this build-up, all the way to trial and execution. So I think there's these mini inbreakings, these mini stories that might resemble it, but then at the end, there's this continuation that's not like a festival. Another might be after the final day. Here's an easy one. After the final day, what happens? Everybody goes home. And at the end of John, and we look at Acts or any other idea on Pentecost, everyone doesn't go home, they go out. They go out together. It is different. One is designed for remembrance, and the other is designed for action and application. One breaks apart to return at another time. The other brings together to venture out. One is about also returning. The festival is not just about breaking out and going home, but you're already thinking about returning. That's for sure, because this is a major festival. You'll probably talk about next year. There will be a return. In this case, there's a departure. And I might say, with no return in terms of the venturing out in Pentecost, or a permanent return, that the church might be that moving tabernacle where you arrive in this kind of festival atmosphere and it doesn't go away. And then finally, one is known, in terms of practice, discipline. Today we might say in our church calendar, our liturgy, our secular holidays, it's known. And the other one is unknown. Or you could flip them, and one is unknown and one is known. So I think we could play around with that. But this is Sarah trying to think about how do we, for those that are uninformed and uneducated on this, like myself, how do you lead a class? And I think a 2-column might get into the poetry of John and might reach into the idea of Pentecost. That's my thoughts.
Bill, what you thinking?
Well, first of all, thank you for the questions, because as I've already said before we started recording, at first I thought, what? I was struggling to understand. But you got me to doing some work. I am one who, for whatever reason, has never had a keen interest in the festivals. I remember in seminary we had a specialist brought in who did a whole class session on the Jewish calendar and the festivals, and I was one of those starry-eyed seminary students whose eyes glazed over a bit. But having said that, it is clear that this is important to John. Caroline Lewis, in her commentary on John, says that John is the only gospel to mention the Feast of Tabernacles directly. Now, I trust her scholarship. I didn't double-check that. Part of her thesis in her commentary is that this is a critically important choice by John in terms of presenting the story. And real quickly, a couple of thoughts. You're asking what can we glean from the elements of this. To play with words a little, this experience involved relocating and dislocating. You noted you had to travel. So that's a relocation. It's also a kind of dislocation. I assume others are like me. I love to go on a trip, but what am I thinking about? I'm looking forward to getting back home. So there's a both and. I've traveled to somebody's wedding and I'm engaged, but my mind is also thinking of coming back home. And I may come home with some new perspective. So it has both. I think that, and I don't know that this is what happened for the first people to experience this. But adding to that dislocation, if you read this whole chapter, is what Jesus comes and does. What was a little dislocating for me is Jesus is deceptive with his brothers. They tell him, it's noted that his biological brothers, I assume it means biological brothers, don't believe. But they say to him, strangely, you need to go to this so you can be seen publicly. And Jesus says, no, I'm not. They go, and then he secretly goes. It's like, wait a minute, what kind of Jesus is this who uses deception? Well, to me it was strategic. He's not wanting to draw undue attention, I think. And then what he says is dislocating. The people get into a discussion of what does this mean, and the religious authorities are upset by it. So perhaps John said it was important to frame this in a context where people were already moved around, their location has changed, they're remembering the wilderness and God was there, and now Jesus is saying, I am God and I am in your presence. A lot we could make of that, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you, Bill. It struck me that this particular festival was about gathering back together at harvest time in celebration of having enough to share. And it was about remembering a time of hardship, a time of testing, a time of trial, a time of learning how to trust God to provide. It reminded me that you would probably sit down at a table with people who were younger than you and people who were older than you and hear stories stories of one time we came together for this particular event. Remember that particular festival, we did this, or we had this set up, or we decorated it this way, or this is what we remembered, because during that year it had been really a difficult year, and we came together, and it was so good to be together. So there would be those kinds of stories being exchanged. There would be a conversation about probably how was God impactful to your life this year? Where did you feel the presence of God leading you like they were led in the desert? How did you feel the hand of God feeding you like you were being fed in the desert? And did you, and you might have had a dry year, maybe you didn't feel the presence of God. Maybe you just had one of those years where you buckled down and you did the thing, you followed the path, you behaved as if, and then suddenly you arrive at the festival, and it's this moment of renewal. So I kind of stepped back and went, this practice of gathering each day, sharing bounty, sharing stories, sharing community, sharing identity, this enrichment that was done deliberately to reground the faith of everybody that participated in who is God to me, and who is God to us as a community, and who is God to us as a country. And this moment of let me experience life like we did when we were wholly dependent upon God. And I thought that was really lovely. Now, to make the leap into Pentecost and the leap into how do we read this with eyes from this side of the resurrection, maybe this is a metaphor for God gathering up Jesus and taking him away. So the gifts of the Lord for the people of the Lord comes to a whole new meaning to me now. So I'm experiencing the bounty of Christ, having him here, having him present, having him practice, having him do miracle after miracle and sign after sign, and suddenly God's going to take Jesus up, and we're only going to be left with memory. We're only going to be left with eyewitness experience. We're only going to be left with gathering together and reminding ourselves what it was like when the Lord was with us, which is very similar to what this festival is all about. So I thought that was really a nice provocative way of connecting the dots together from a lectionary perspective. The other piece that's valuable to me is this moment of traveling to gather the water and bring it back and pour it out, as if there's a cleansing, a communal cleansing that takes place. And in doing that, we're inviting the Spirit of the Lord to come. So those were the connections I made as I was kind of trying to figure out, as a layperson, why is this here, and why is it important, and how do I make sense of it? So that leads me to a second question.
Can I make a comment here, Sarah?
Oh, please jump in.
I think there's a learning for us here to think about how Thanksgiving functions somewhat like that, but it really not in quite the same way it did at this point. At this point, and the purpose of this event, this was one of the three major festivals like that occurred in this time among the Jewish people. But to imagine, this is not just families coming together to say thanks. They probably don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about that, but but in any case, my point is that this was a national occasion. This is when the whole country, as one, to the extent it could be one, gathered around the temple at that point and performing the various actions that they did around the temple in terms of marching around it, and then on the last day, on the seventh day, marching around it 7 times. All these were ways of expressing as a united country, I would say a united nation, their appreciation for and acknowledgement of the gifts that they had received in terms of the harvest that they had done. And there was a time in this country when that would have made more sense to more people, because there was a much larger percentage of the population that was engaged in agriculture. That number has dwindled dramatically, so that most of us don't have that sense of a harvest. Most of us simply lack that. And one of the things that I think this country now sorely lacks is a sense of common bond, of togetherness. If you imagine what it would look like in Washington if there was a large crowd that gathered, it would be a disparate crowd that would as likely gather, end up in fights rather than in celebrations. And it's something that we miss as a nation. Thank you.
So question number 2. What do we know about the Pool of Siloam, the Gahan Spring, which feeds it, and its significance to the Festival of Tabernacles, the Temple, and Jerusalem? Bill, you want to take this one?
Reluctantly. Again, I acknowledge that I've had to do some digging here, and I'm sure we've all found much of the same experience, that there were apparently at some point actually 2 pools, and it was a source of water. And as you've already noted, this was involved in this. The spring was there year round, but it was an important factor in this festival of tabernacles. And you've noted the sense of cleansing. We've talked many times. Water it nourishes us, it cleanses us, it provides for crops. There's that whole powerful imagery of the cleansing, and Jesus talks about himself as the water of life and later as the bread of life. That whole issue of moving from the literal to whatever word you want to use, a symbolic or existential, I think runs throughout John. And here's where I suspect our not being people of that time, we really cannot fully grasp the power that this would have had for people. But having said that, I can have some understanding that it did have a very powerful experience. I've had other kinds of experiences. I mentioned some of in the other podcasts, the backpacking and some of the vistas that I saw on the Appalachian Trail are moments like that for me, where the literal physical experience took on a not contradictory, but a deeper, richer experience. So I think I can at least seek to understand that this experience was very powerful and undoubtedly represented many meanings to people. As Charles has noted, particularly those grounded in agriculture will understand the meaning of water. It's not just to nurture me, to slack my thirst. It slacks the earth's thirst. It's the very essence of life. And I'll leave it there, Sarah, for myself.
Don?
I dug into the history of the engineering, and it was helpful to me. So I, up front made it clear I don't know about the festival, but I do understand plumbing. so if you go through the history of this space, you're going to see that there was multiple engineering going on to move the water into the city, to move the water to the people. And that is something we have in common today, and that space had in common over thousands of years. There's been flowing water, moving water, pools of water, but not necessarily where the people needed it. So the people had to engineer that, and the history makes it very clear, and the scripture makes it clear that they're engineering it for the festival. And I think we can connect that to Pentecost. Now, are we engineering that anymore? Not necessarily. So it's almost like you could say Jesus stands up at the middle and says, I am the moving cistern, not the moving tabernacle. I'm the moving cistern, and I flow out. So even though there's flowing water, it ain't where you need it. And so I think if you're managing a class, that might be a good way to look at it. Even today, we're in great crisis around the world because we have flowing water, but it ain't where we need it. And so I think that's a great way to look at the tabernacle. Also, I think what's not said but could work is festivals are about plenty and scarcity. If you're having a festival of harvest, remembrance, and thanksgiving, I have no doubt that you also reflect on periods of scarcity. This does not seem to be a period of scarcity, but I think we're invited to think about what is that like in scarcity. So there's a memory of plenty and a memory of scarcity, and apparently water is scarce anyway because you have to engineer it to get it there in the first place. So water is always scarce because it's over there in the pool or in the spring. You know, there are actually a history of aqueducts bringing this in from that spring. There are all kinds of different techniques, and Jesus stands in the middle and goes, "It's flowing out. I am. I'm overriding with my language. I am the moving cistern." And then, in a related way, I think, and this goes back to your first question. You know, this is one of many festivals, and I think we're on the celestial calendar in that way. This is harvest time. The earth is moving around the sun. It's that particular time. And because of John and in the synoptics, you have these mini pieces, right, with a beginning and a middle and an end. The festival has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it ends. And we have a woman of the well. This story has a beginning, the middle, and an end. And the trial of Jesus, the beginning, the middle, and an end. It's all these mini stories in it. So one thing that might be fun for a class is to say, well, when we're looking at this festival, what comes next? And I'll make it generic without commenting on any faith, any culture at all, saying what we have in common. The next festival, I think, has something to do with the harvest as well, the memory of the harvest, and it's going to be a festival of the first wine. So I'll just let that stand. It's the solstice. It's midwinter. Our tradition and our liturgy has that in it as well. We're going to taste this harvest in our tradition and in the tradition we're reading about a few months down the road to remember the past and remember the inbreaking of the spring. So it's almost like, what's the next story as the earth continues to move around the sun? That's my best shot there.
Charles, do you have anything to offer?
I'm cool.
All right. So the Pool of Siloam, we've met before. There's references to this in the 2 Kings about it being important to the development of this particular city at this particular place and becoming the water source for much more than the temple. There is conversation in the book of John about this particular place, the Pool of Siloam. The blind man who Jesus heals is told to go and wash in the Pool of Siloam. So I think there's some interesting nuance for us to tease out. And you know, I may go too far, but the Pool of Siloam, which in the book of John, chapter 9, verse 7, we're told means scent. That Siloam, the word, means scent. So the pool of scent, I find it extraordinarily metaphoric that we're partaking in a water source that means scent, which means you're going to go through this festival. You're going to experience 7 days of the festival itself, an 8th day we're going to talk about next. And then you're going to be sent out. You're going to be pushed out into the world to become a source of water for those around you, metaphorically. So the practice of remembrance, of understanding that everything we have comes from the hand of God, that grounding or that touching of that memory will push us into productivity, will push us into places in time where the Spirit will move us to remember at just the right moment something essential that somebody will need, that we can offer or share. So I thought that the importance to the geography of the development of the city of Jerusalem was really interesting, that the pool of Siloam, the pool of scent, will feed the city. I found it important that the priest goes and gets water from this particular pool, from that particular spring, and brings it into the temple as a practice, a discipline, an intentionality that we could visit and spend some time with. I also thought it was important that without the pool of Siloam, what would happen? Without the spring of Gihon, what would happen? Jerusalem would die. It would move. It would move to wherever the water went. Which is, if you think about water being the metaphor for Christ, we're going to move wherever Christ goes. We're going to have to leave Jerusalem. We're going to have to leave the temple. We're going to have to depart from all that is familiar and follow the water. So I spent some time thinking about that. I'll move into question 3. Shemini Atzeret was the 8th day. And the language that's used is to hold in repose, to pause, to tarry a little longer with the Lord. And I thought that was really a lovely idea, because here's Jesus feeling the want to tarry a little longer with the people, and the people feeling the need to cling or to hold on to the risen Lord. But he's going to have to go. So this 8th day, which in this particular festival, when people make note of it and have described it, they're saying you've never really experienced true joy until you've experienced this particular day in Jerusalem at the temple. And that day you can see what living joy looks like by the behavior and the action of the people as they celebrate the communing with God. Which I thought to myself, well, that's beautiful. That's a wonderful moment. And it's from that enriching moment of joy that these people will be sent forth until the next festival. So they'll leave that, and it's going to be the fuel that gives them the energy to move through the next bit of time. And I think that that's the same thing that's true with the disciples and with Jesus and the outpouring of the Spirit, that there's something so tender, so rich about that it's going to sustain them for a longer period of time. So tell me what your thoughts are about the festival of Shemini Atzeret holding a unique significance. I put my questions behind me, sorry. And prior to and during the time of Jesus, and what are your thoughts about its significance for us today as we experience this pandemic and move into the season of Pentecost? Don, you want to take a shot?
I'll do my best, but I just like what you said. I'll write in the margins of what you said. And I am worried about commenting on culture, festivals, faith, that I'm only getting a glimpse of. So I just want to keep saying that there's so many precious things in all of this and over the thousands of years. And this lives on. this festival in so many ways. And I just want to be careful that I'm getting a glimpse of something that's wonderful. So I'm trying to find something that works, and it's that final day, the great day, the 8th day, and I'm with you. The word I would use would be the imprint is needed, that final great day where we say it again. And there's a tradition of doing the 8th day. Like now we're back here again. Listen, remember, taste, smell, family, extended community. Remember, remember, remember. And I think that would carry through for any festival or any event, that it could even have sadness in it because there's a parting. You know it's going to happen, but you know as the sun goes, as the earth goes around the sun, we will be together again. And there's something there. The difference with the Pentecost is it keeps going, because it doesn't, the eighth, it's always the 8th maybe. It keeps going. So I would see it as an imprint, except with Pentecost you don't venture out. It's kind of carry it with you like the water that's running. And I was thinking about, is there an application to today? Again, I'll say if you're watching this a year down the road, we're in pandemic now, we're in lockdown, and we're all in our homes or where we're locked down today. And maybe there is that when there is a pause from normal life or normal business, that we are in a period of 8 days. In this case, we're in month 3, but things will change. And what do we do right now to say remember, remember, remember? Because we are thinking and we are acting differently. I know we are. I feel different. What do we do with that? Part of it is I think we're meeting as a lectionary team to talk about it. So I think there's an application with just when something different happens. It could be a terrible crisis for a family, or it could be being locked down with this. But what does this mean right now as we venture out? And the reason I'm saying that is I think human beings, and especially 21st century Americans, are very good at collective amnesia. And I think human beings over time have always been. And that's why we always have the 8th day. Always have the 8th day. And then we do it again and again and again. And I think there's something in terms of the carrying through and the flowing of Christ that works with that as well. That's it.
Bill?
Thank you, Don. I think in some ways what I want to share briefly builds on what you were saying. If I understood you, first of all, I would affirm what I would call the sense of humility, that we cannot really enter into the fullness of what this meant then. I've said that already. One thing that occurs to me is that the 8th day, and I think one of you earlier said, and I had missed this detail, that the 8th day they had gone back home. Whether they're still in Jerusalem or back home doesn't matter greatly to me, because the 8th day is a kind of portal. It's either I'm already back home or I'm going to go back home. Okay, I've had this experience of remembering. Now I'm going home. And as someone who likes the emphasis on the power of choice, I'm either home or going home, and I have choices to make. I've remembered God was there. God provided in the wilderness. Even if this was a bad year, God still provides. The other part of it is, and I mentioned the dislocation, what happened to Jesus reminds us of what we've done throughout history to prophets. Don, again, the repetitiveness. We keep doing, we keep forgetting. We kill the prophets, and the prophets are speaking to us. I believe that word in English comes from the Greek meaning to speak beforehand or on behalf of. Gandhi, Socrates, Martin Luther King Jr. We kill the prophets, and I think about today and this season, and look at what happens to what I believe are the prophets who offer caution to us, who present other perspectives on how to interpret the medical information, and particularly those, to me, in my opinion, grounded in data and facts. Look at how they're being treated. There's a cautionary tale here. It's fine to be excited and to do these special things, but remember, and there are those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat, particularly the mistakes of history. So I think of that 8th day, Sarah, as a portal. We're stepping back, and we're also stepping forward. Thank you.
Sarah, could I jump in real quick right here?
Yeah.
I was just watching the clock, make sure that we're running on time. If you have a follow-up, we'll go with that, and then I'm going to turn to Charles for a synthesis.
I'm done. I was going to hand it off to Charles.
Oh, thank you. Charles, before we wrap up, we'll go to you to see if you want to add anything or do a summary of this conversation.
I'm not going to try to summarize the conversation. I'm going to add another piece to it and then stop. And that is that, unless I misread, the great difference between the meals of the first 7 days and the meal of this 8th day, meals of the 7th days, you remember, they were shared. People actually were outside of these booths, in addition to being inside, I suppose, too, but they were sharing their meals. The meal on the 8th day was eaten in the home. And I thought, wow, that's right where we are. Right where we are. We can learn from that. I stopped.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks. And Sarah, thank you for your questions. They created, for me, a lot of healthy work that I wouldn't have done. I'm better off because of it. And I was wondering, for those that are preparing for classes, could you, before we say goodbye, just, if you have them in front of you, just review the question 1, 2, 3 one more time, please?
Sure. Question number 1. What insights can we glean from considering the ingathering and the symbolic elements of the Festival of Tabernacles as a backdrop for Pentecost? Question number 2. What do you know about the Pool of Siloam, the Gihon Spring, which feeds it, and its significance to the Festival of Tabernacles, the Temple, and to Jerusalem? And question number 3. The 8th day of the festival, the Shemini Atzeret, held a unique significance prior to and during the time of Jesus. What are your thoughts about its significance for us today as we experience the pandemic and move into the Pentecost season?
Thank you. Any final words from you, Sarah, before we say goodbye?
Have a great week.
Well, for folks listening in, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And you are always welcome, and we'll see you next time.